Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to Best and Worst Albums from Cheap Trick. So, big artists who have big catalogs often have a lot of what people might call their best album, and I think it makes it really hard to narrow down, to pin down what those are. Which ones are the very best? Which ones are the stellar albums? But to equal degree, it can be really hard as so many of them are good as to say which one is the worst album. Doesn't mean we don't like it, but out of the whole catalog, which one is the worst? And sometimes, there is a real stinker in there and it's easy to make that decision. But for this episode, we're going to be focusing on power pop band Cheap Trick and their 20 studio albums to present which Cheap Trick albums are the best and worst. So we'll get into that here in just a bit. But before we start, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like. All those things do help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, if you turn on notifications, you'll never miss an episode and stay up to date on really cool things just like this with best and worst albums from Cheap Trick. All right, so right away, 20 studio albums, so many cool ones to pull from. And I do want to just point out that they've sort of had a resurgence in recent years, putting out some of their best stuff, including their last three, which I think have been absolutely stellar. And for a band to be doing it as good as they are this late in the game, including their latest album, 2021's In Another World album. This one here totally shocked me with how good it was for a band so late into their career. But lots of good stuff. So trying to narrow down what are the best albums. That's what we're going to kick off here. We'll do the worst albums, second part to this here. And so I want to start with this one. The debut studio album from 1977. I think this one here is a really good, interesting album. The band, they were young, they were hungry. The production on it, the rawness of it actually works to the advantage of the band here at this point. The thing is, when the album came out, it didn't do a whole lot of anything, didn't even crack the Billboard 200, just ran under the radar for most people, at least until they released At Budokan in 1978. And if we were talking about live albums, that one would probably be the one most people would put at the top of the heap. But I'm talking the studio albums here. Which is the best in terms of their studio albums? This one here, though, certainly has gained a cult following over the years. The stature of this thing has been, cited by so many different bands up and coming, especially in the late 80s, early 90s. Grunge artists, Nirvana, Smashing Pumpkins, Green Day, all citing Cheap Trick, that album, but also the first three studio albums leading up to Budokan. I mean, if you ask anyone, most people will cite those first four albums, the three studio, the one live album. But I think this one is a great one. It's a fantastic album, definitely in the running for best album. Now, this one here I know is going to be a controversial one, as maybe even the next one. My whole thing might even be controversial, but I don't care. These are the ones that I like. These are the ones that I think are absolutely outstanding. Busted from 1990. It's their 11th studio album, and it was the follow-up to the very successful 1988 album Lap of Luxury, which maybe a lot of you guys thought I would have been talking about that album. But I think this one here, where they tried to repeat the success of that and didn't have it happen, although I think this album is far superior. Busted does everything right that I think Lap of Luxury got wrong. Sort of took the tongue-in-cheek cheesiness out of where that album was and brought it home here. And I really think that Busted has so much more going on it than what people initially thought. When first single Can't Stop Falling Into Love came out, and even though that actually climbed to number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100, and so maybe a lot of people do love this album because of that, I think it set up the wrong tone for the album because the album itself is really quite a rockin' album. And I don't think that single really represents it the way that the album should be. If you check out Black and Blue, I Can't Understand It, and the title track Busted, oh my God, I think it's some of the best songs that they ever put out. And, you know, The album really should have fared better than it did. Unfortunately, it didn't, but I still think it's one of the best Cheap Trick albums out there. I don't care what anyone says. I still like this album a lot. Next one to touch on here, again, as I said, might be a controversial one. Woke Up With a Monster in 1994. One and only album that they did for Warner Brothers after leaving Epic Records. They got signed to Warner and put this one out here. It's even produced by Ted Templeman, who of course is made famous for having worked with Van Halen, David Lee Roth, and a number of other killer artists. But this one here didn't try to soften the sound the way that The Flame, when they brought that in and had the band do it in 1988 on Lap of Luxury. And don't get me wrong, I love that song. I absolutely do. But this one here focused on rock. It really returned the band to that form. And even though 5 singles were released from the album, it just kind of sunk without a trace. A lot of it having to do with the year 1994. Remember, a lot of grunge bands are citing Cheap Trick, but Cheap Trick couldn't get arrested at this point, unfortunately. They didn't get that cool banner like Neil Young did, Godfather of Grunge. Not that they were, Cheap Trick is grunge, but even though a lot of alternative and grunge bands cited them, like those earlier albums, they weren't really shown the same light. But regardless, I think this album is a stellar album. It didn't get the radio love. It didn't get the MTV love. But this one here is a strong album from start to finish on it. Kicking off with My Gang, just a really cool, rockin', playful song that they do, and Woke Up With a Monster title track on here. When I heard the 1-2 punch of that, I knew this album was going to be really good, and it just keeps on going all the way through it. I actually really like the last 2 songs on here as well, Crybaby and Love Me For a Minute. I wanted to point those 2 out on here as being really strong songs as well. A lot of people, if you don't make it all the way to the end of the album, people just check out 1 and 2 and skip it and they're done with that. But I think this album here brought the band back to the caliber of their 70s and early 80s stuff. But they did it, of course, for the 90s. So I just wanted to, again, throw that one in there. Loving that one. And then we're going to jump way ahead to the latest, which was the latest at the time, but obviously not the latest any longer. Came out in 2009, 16th studio album. Last to feature the original 4 members of the band, as Bunny Carlos, their drummer, would leave in 2010. But this one here, really, really strong. One of my favorite tracks on here, When the Lights Go Out, which is a Slade cover song. Same kind of thing, as often happens, I think, with great cover songs. If you don't know that it's a cover song because it sounds so much like the band who's doing it, then I think that's a perfect song that a band would cover. When bands bring in and cover something that is night and day different than them and then have a hit with it or something and wonder why nothing else is a hit, it's because you don't sound like that. But in this case, they actually did a Slade song that I think fit them perfectly. And it's great, but there are so many really good originals on this album as well. Miss Tomorrow, Sick Man of Europe, Every Day You Make Me Crazy, but the list goes on. A stellar album from start to finish on this thing. You just can't go wrong with it. It brought back a real cohesiveness for the band that I think had been lacking on a few of the earlier albums, or earlier, I mean the ones right before this one. Raw rock quality throughout this thing, great melody, power pop perfection on this one. But I think it's one of their strongest albums in their entire career right here, even as late as 2009. Okay, so out of all 20 studio albums, which is the best Cheap Trick? And it really was hard for me to pare this down. And I think a lot of people might say this album that I'm going to bring up here, but Dream Police, 1979, their 4th studio album, a huge album for them because it was the follow-up to At Budokan from 78, the classic live album. And yes, if we were talking about live albums, you could throw that one in, but we're talking about their 20 studio albums. And I think this is where everything came together for the band. The 3 studio albums that came before this one are classic in and of their own right, and I still love that debut album. But the production on those was a lot more raw. And I think everything that was sort of lacking on those was really honed together properly on this one. The band also starts to explore other avenues. They expand their songwriting, they get into some longer, more complex styles of songs, they add in orchestration. But everything that I love about studio albums was achieved on this one here. So it takes everything that, yes, we love about those first three, the raw sort of punk stylings of that with the power pop perfection and everything. And then the energy from the live show, but it wrapped all of that stuff up in a nice succinct bow. And I think that it happens on this one here. And to boot, we got a lot of killer tracks on this album as well. The title track alone, Dream Police, which is my favorite song. So, I mean, if it wasn't for that, I probably would have been picking the album anyway. But I mean, or just because of that, I'd be picking the album anyway. But there's a lot of other great songs on this. Way of the World is a cool standout track. Gonna Raise Hell, another one right there. Need Your Love, how can you not love that song? And Voices, which is also one of my absolute favorite tracks by the band. And so having all those songs, but again, start to finish, great tracks on this one. I don't think you can go wrong with it. So to me, it's a no-brainer for it to be the perfect album, picking Dream Police. But, you know, some of you guys, I'm sure you're going to have some other ones, and you'll be able to leave those in the comments. So let's shift gears. Let's talk about the worst albums. And I don't think Cheap Trick actually made any bad albums. There's less favorite albums. There's the ones that I don't reach for as often. And that's really how I decided to narrow this down. So I'm going to reach for two of these here that when I picked these up, I would have thought, hands down, these would be the albums that I would go to all that often. And if you know me, you watch my channel, and you saw some of the ones I picked for best albums, you would think to yourself, these albums out of the 80s would have to be Brendan's favorite albums, right? But they're not. I just don't find these albums all that interesting. So I'm going to start off with Standing on the Edge from 1985, their 8th studio album. It was supposed to see the band really returning to a hard rock sound and formula, and they did some of that on here, but they just didn't do it in a full sort of holistic way that I think they could have, the way that they did far better, I think, when they did Woke Up With a Monster. But they do have the hit Tonight It's You, and that song always makes me want to grab this album, throw it on, and then I'm disappointed with the rest of the stuff. But the use of the electronic drums and the overuse of the keyboards on here is, in the end of the day, what I find to be very dating about the album. It doesn't just hold up, unfortunately, the way that I would have wanted it to, where you've got such a great standout track, Tonight It's You. There just aren't other songs on the album that carry it along the way. And it lacks that raw energy of the earlier albums. And it lacks the cohesiveness of some of the albums that came out after that. And it just was not brought all the way through on this one here. And so this is one of the ones that, like I said, I keep wanting to enjoy. I keep thinking I'm going to, and it has just never grown on me the way that I want it to in all the recent years that I've had that album. And it is the same with the follow-up album, The Doctor from 1986. So ninth studio album, it just continues the downward spiral that started on previous album, Standing on the Edge. So we just keep going here. But what I kind of find to be interesting with this album, The Doctor, is they hired Tony Platt to produce the album. He's the one who came in and mixed or engineered this, that brought in the keyboards and stuff like that. So I was really surprised to see that they would continue on with that. Now, mindsets might have been different. We have to remember that it was the 1980s. And so I kind of understand why they were reliant so heavily on it. I mean, you had bands like ZZ Top doing Afterburner, just taking keyboards, synthesizers, and all that sort of stuff to the nth degree, the maxing that stuff out as much as they could. And that's what they started to do here. They were reliant more heavily on synthesizers on here. and I just don't think it worked. It also didn't translate. It's not one of those ones I want to go back to. Uh, whereas I love going back to the ZZ Top trilogy of albums that have the synthesizer on it and everything, but just doesn't happen here for Cheap Trick. Still a good album. It's not a bad album. It's got its own standout tracks on it. Not a lot of them. It's Only Love. I like that song. And Kiss Me Red, another good one on here. But unfortunately, those two tracks don't save the album. And so I have to put this in as one of the worst albums from them. And you might be thinking, if those are the worst ones, what could possibly be worse than that? I don't know if this one is worse than that, but it's definitely one that I probably reach for even less. And I had an entirely different opinion about it at the time. And I hope one day my opinion changes again, because what are we if not creatures who can have our minds change and different whims, and the wind blows one way and you like it, and then another blows another way and you don't. But right now, I'm saying that this is the quote worst album, but as I said, I don't think that Cheap Trick has made any bad albums. Self-titled from 1997. So 13th studio album, second to be self-titled, right? We had the debut from 77, and then 20 years on, they tried to replicate its success. And I think that's what the album art, the black and white art, the self-titled, 77, 97, all that sort of stuff was supposed to signify. I know that it was talked up. The band was going back to their roots. They were going to be, capitalize on that whole alternative rock, punk thing. They were going to get down and dirty with it, all that sort of stuff. They were signed to an indie label now. They weren't on big mega labels like Epic and Warner Brothers. They had Steve Albini produce 2 songs that were on a 45, not ones that are on here. They've later turned up on, I think, bonus tracks when these get reissued, but it was a 45 at the time. And actually, I got I guess a CD single, if you will, that came with it that has the 2 tracks on it. So I really dug that. But this here, for me, I find it lacking interest, character, life, enthusiasm, power of the debut, like everything that those first 3 albums have that so many people talk about, cite, and love, that was supposed to be the return to this album here, didn't happen in my opinion. It's quite mundane and boring, and I hate to use those words because it's not always a bad thing for an album. Sometimes you are in that vein, in that mindset, but I'm very rarely in the alternative rock vein, and that's what I see this album as, is Cheap Trick's alternative rock album. A lot of bands from the 70s, 80s, and early 90s shifted gears when grunge hit and alternative rock exploded and made their alternative rock album. A lot of my favorite glam metal bands went down that road. It was awful 99% of the time, and a lot of other bands tried to do the same thing, and that's what I see this one is here. I think they failed miserably on it, in my opinion. I just remember at the time getting it and being super disappointed. But remember, I was comparing it to this. I loved the way the band sounded here. In fact, let's go back and remember that I think the 2 previous albums are 2 of their absolute best. So when they finally come back and make their next album here, and you know how drastically these sound, it's understandable as to why I might at least feel the way that I do about it. I get it if you guys don't. That's totally cool. We all have our opinions on these things. So the thing is, I think the production was solely lacking on this. I'm going to bring it all down to that, but also things like, I think Robin's vocals were poorly recorded on this, because I know he doesn't have a bad voice. He has a great voice, but on the song, anytime the opening track, he's screaming on it to the point that it doesn't sound like singing, and I don't like it. It's a little cacophonous, and I don't enjoy that one. But then there's some songs like Hard to Tell, the second track, which I think is a great track. And every time I get past Any Time and I get into Hard to Tell, I go, oh, right, this is going to be a good album. And then it just peels away again, and I don't like it. I do like the song Say Goodbye. That one was released as a single from it. Should have had better legs than it did. Unfortunately, it didn't. And on this album here, Sunk Without a Trace, even worse, than the previous two. So, if you're calling those albums bad, they did far better than this one in the end of the day. But that's neither here nor there. It all comes down to personal preference and opinion. I'm citing this one as their worst album, my least favorite. Let's call it that, right? Can we all agree on that? So there you go. Let's pull out, where is it? Best album versus worst album. There we go. Cheap Trick, head to head, right? That's what happens at least. So let me know, what do you guys think? What is your best album from Cheap Trick? What do you think is their worst album? And we can have another head to head on all of that. But all right, everyone, take care. Have a good one. And I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.